Welcome to the Dose of Good podcast, where we celebrate good people and organizations working to make the world a better place. It can be easy to get caught up in the bad things going on in the world and forget about the good happening all around us each and every day. I'm your host, Erin, and I want to share these stories with you and give them the attention they deserve. I hope this podcast educates and inspires you and maybe even motivates you to share a dose of good in your community. Now let's get into today's episode. Today's episode features Brigid's House of Hope, and I speak with Executive Director Miranda Lane and Program Director Sarah Holt. Every episode of the Dose of Good podcast, I feel, has been impactful in some way. But I have to say that this was one of the most impactful episodes for me. And that's because we cover the topic of human trafficking. And this is a topic that I've heard about. You hear it on the news, you maybe seen it in a movie or TV show. But I don't think we really have a full, or at least speaking for myself, I didn't really have a full understanding of it, how it works, where it happens, have a really good grasp on it. And after today's episode, I feel that I've been educated, my eyes have been opened a little bit, and I hope that you will give it a good listen to be educated yourself. I hope that you will share the episode with as many people as you can so we can bring awareness to this issue and hopefully have an impact on it happening to less people, but just to give people more awareness of the fact that it is going on. It is going on in your state, in your community. It's being perpetrated by not necessarily the people you may think. While it is a heavy topic, I think it is an important topic and definitely one that everybody should be more educated on. So I thank Sarah and Miranda for giving me this education and helping to bring awareness to this issue. Brigid's House of Hope is doing their part to help those in New Hampshire, but there is a lot more work that can be done in New Hampshire and across the country. And I hope that you will keep that in mind, check out their website, and hopefully donate. But now, let's get into the episode. Today I'm here with Dr. Miranda Lane, the Executive Director of Brigid's House of Hope, as well as Sarah Holt, Program Director. Thank you both for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you. So to start, I'd like to just talk a little bit about human trafficking, because I think a lot of people have this idea about it being in a faraway place, big cities, more populated areas, not really thinking, oh, that goes on in New Hampshire. So could you give us a little bit of background on what it is exactly?
So human trafficking is, to put it very simply, modern day slavery. So it is when a person or group of people take control in some way or another of another person or group of people for the benefit of making money off of them most of the time and or getting sexual services from them. It is something that happens everywhere. It happens, in big cities and things like that, but it also happens in rural areas. People can be trafficked by their uncle out of their home, right? It can be literally anywhere that these things happen. And really what it is the victim or the survivor in the situation has no control over most of the things in their life, whether it's their documentation. If they happen to be an immigrant, that's why it's commonly thought of as an immigrant thing, because perpetrators will use that to their advantage by taking their immigration paperwork or becoming their sponsor and then not doing anything with it. They could have control over where they live. A majority of the time, that's what it's like, where the living conditions are not exactly up to standard of what a normal person should be living in. They can have control over their finances most of the time. Basically everything that would be able to enable that person to have their own freedom Perpetrators are good at maintaining that power and control. And they like to prey on vulnerabilities. So whether that is someone is being an immigrant, or they're a young runaway, or they're in foster care, or they're dealing with mental illness or substance abuse, all of those things are vulnerabilities that, unfortunately, traffickers are really good at finding and picking out.
I think sometimes, a lot of times people confuse like human smuggling with human trafficking, or, the word trafficking, I think, gets people a little confused. They think about drug trafficking, which is like taking a substance across a border or something. Human trafficking doesn't require movement of any kind, especially over any kind of border. And the power and control that perpetrators have over their victims is really like three main things, right? It's force, fraud, and coercion. So sometimes I think when people, can kind of wrap their mind around, okay, so you don't have to necessarily be moving people or smuggling people. It can look like that, but it doesn't always. There is overlap, but it doesn't always look like that. Then sometimes they think, well, they're being maybe physically held against their will in a particular location. And again, it can look like that, but more often the power and control that's exerted over someone is things like completely controlling their finances, completely isolating people from anyone else in their life, and then just a lot of mental stuff that goes into making someone feel afraid of you, afraid that you're going to hurt somebody that they care about, those kinds of things. So they might not, be physically being restrained, or it's not always, violent in terms of physical harm keeping them where they are, but the threat of those things happening to them or to somebody else.
And you kind of covered a lot of what I was going to ask already, but so is there anything in particular that people should watch? I mean, obviously being vulnerable in some way, not, like you said, not having, but is there anything particular they should look out for or be aware of to potentially prevent this happening to them?
There can be a few things, some stories that I've heard in the past have been, girls going shopping at the mall and another older woman approaching them saying, hey, you want to join our modeling agency? You're very beautiful. Kind of preying on their young age and also perhaps insecurities. It can look like a situation where people are actually snatching people off the street, although that's pretty uncommon. Most of the time, those three things, force, fraud, and coercion, personally from what I've seen, I'd say that the coercion and the fraud part are more common from what I've seen. I don't know statistics on that, but the fraud can be things like false job postings, right? If you're looking for a job and you see a job posting with very little information, you should be very careful about going to an interview or anything like that with that. The coercion part of it, unfortunately, is what makes a lot of victims feel like it's their fault, because they, in those situations, a lot of the time, they felt that they made the decision to get into whatever the situation is, right? Like if somebody decides to go live on a farm because they were told, that they could live in their house and that they could, make some money off of it, when in reality, that person makes them live in a shack on the property and, all of these different pieces of it, they still think, well, I made the decision to come here, so it's kind of my own fault. So in those situations, we really like to make sure that survivors know, like, it isn't your fault. It's the fault of the perpetrator for lying to you.
Right.
So in terms of keeping yourself safe, I would say approach things like that with caution, especially working stuff. Labor trafficking is just as common as sex trafficking is. But most people, when they hear human trafficking, think about sex trafficking.
Okay.
It is pretty common, of course, but there's a lot of different types of trafficking that include different types of labor, right? We got food service, spas, nail salons, farming,
in-home
all those different things.
caretaking,
Yeah.
those kinds of things.
Yeah.
Okay.
And those can end up turning into domestic servitude situations, especially if the survivor doesn't have a huge support network. So if you are looking into a job like that or something similar, it might be good to have somebody maybe with you when you go to the interview, or even just knowing where you're going and what's going on. Yeah.
Yeah, I think for other people kind of wanting to watch out for folks that they care about, you know, some of the signs that something might be happening that's not good are some of the things that we think about for, I think the tricky part is that it looks like a lot of things. It looks like, you know, someone's mental health getting significantly worse all of a sudden, or maybe their substance use has become more severe, or they've started using substances and they never did before. They start pulling back from the people that they were connected with and just being very isolated. So those are signs that are hard to read sometimes for a lot of people. I mean, they're very similar to signs that of if someone you care about is becoming very depressed, or if someone you care about is in a situation where there's intimate partner violence, or, you know, it can look like a lot of things. So I think one of the hard parts about human trafficking is it's not necessarily super easy to just see really blatantly. And even one of the challenges in the work that we do is even victims don't always identify that they're being trafficked until they've maybe gotten out of the situation and have engaged with some kind of care provider who can say, this is the truth of what was going on, especially that, you know, it's not your fault. And this thing that was happening was really not okay.
Yeah.
So I think, you know, there are a lot of great organizations that put out flyers and to try to raise awareness, and they talk about keeping an eye out at different points of transit for when people are moved, because, you know, trafficking doesn't have to include movement, but it can. And so that's why I think there are posters up at truck stops and in airports and hotels and things where those kinds of transactions can happen. And so, you know, I think anytime there's really a lot to be said for people's instinct and just feeling like something's not right. There's honestly even research that shows that that's a pretty decent way of telling if something feels unsafe. And in those situations, if you think that something is happening, then you need to call someone and not intervene in the moment, because that can make everyone very unsafe pretty immediately. Yeah.
Oh, so just to follow up on a few things. So it can be a stranger that initiates this, or it could be a relative, somebody you know.
And most often it's the second one.
Okay.
So I
like
think,
a partner.
yeah, there's a lot of folks who, again, there's so many conceptions that we have about what human trafficking is, and some of that is because of like movies and TV. And right, our founder starts a lot of her talks by saying, like, this is not the movie Taken, like Liam Neeson is not here. That's not what we're talking about right now. And I think one of those really core misconceptions is that human trafficking looks like you getting snatched in a store parking lot or in another country or something. And honestly, the majority, and I mean the vast majority of trafficking is perpetuated by someone that the person knows. Mostly that's parents and partners. And that can also include, though, family members and family friends. So that's the unfortunate and really heartbreaking truth about this kind of violence, and about a lot of violence that's perpetrated toward people, is that in some ways it's easier to understand if it feels like it's something that's out of, like it's someone that you don't know. It's kind of sporadic, or it's something that you can't see coming. And I think a lot of those things are still true. It just happens really within a family system or within, you know, the support network of a person, which is also part of why it makes that mental coercion so
Powerful.
so powerful and so effective. Because, you know, a lot of folks start being victimized when they're kids, and they don't how would they know any different?
Right. And these are people you're supposed to trust.
Yeah.
And
I do want to clarify, too, when we were talking about the definition of human trafficking earlier, the force, fraud, and coercion piece of it is not relevant if it's a child being used for commercial sex acts.
Okay.
So if it doesn't matter how somebody takes advantage of a child for commercial sex because they are not able to consent, they are not.
Right.
It's a trafficking situation.
Okay.
So, you know, you could think about it that way, but when it comes to with children, it can be pretty easy for someone to take advantage of the relationship they have with the kids. So when we're talking to parents about these kinds of things that I think they should be careful of is like those family friends, right? So those people that you may know but may not totally know all the way. Watching your kids here and there, like that's okay. But if it's like a regular thing, if you don't know them, it's probably good to look into who they are. Something that I've learned recently is that ski lodges in the winter are common places for trafficking of children because a lot of schools send kids on skiing trips and things like that without their parents with them. So making sure that there's some sort of communication with your child if they're going on something like that. Making sure there is a chaperone who is paying attention to what's going on. Those kinds of things are pretty important. But again, it's also important to recognize that a lot of the time when people find out who the perpetrator was, at first they probably don't believe it because it's someone that they've known for a while and that they have trusted in other ways. So it can be kind of difficult to point those things out, which is why it's really important that kids have someone that they feel like it's safe to talk to, whether it's a family member, a coach, a friend even, whatever it might be, having someone for them to be able to go to and say, this situation doesn't seem right to me.
Yeah.
That can get them the help that they need sooner than later to prevent the situation from getting worse.
And I think another idea people have is that this mainly happens to women. Is that accurate, or does it happen to men as well?
It does happen to both. Okay. I would say when it comes to men being sex trafficked, most of the time it's men within the LGBTQ community. However, sex trafficking can happen no matter what gender the person is. Same thing with labor trafficking. There might be some fields that are more, more men do those kinds of things, like farming or things like that, or vice versa, like nail salons, things like that. But it's not necessarily based on the gender. It's based on the benefit to the perpetrator in that situation, right? Okay. What kind of person can I take advantage of to do this thing that I want them to do? Is it a woman who's looking for a job as a nail tech? Probably, right? You're probably not going to find as many men that are looking for that. So I wouldn't say it's not necessary. I would say it's not necessarily based on gender. Okay. But the vulnerabilities that person has and what the perpetrator can use to take advantage of that.
And the populations that we see are, like, by and large, definitely women, especially like within our organization. That's almost exclusively who we have served, and not because we're limited to that, but because that's just who comes to us.
Sure.
Some of that, I think, is that there are, or there may be, we don't have really great data. It's likely that there are higher rates that happen in women, and because we kind of expect women to be the victims of something like that, they're the ones that are going to get caught a little bit first, right? They're the ones who a provider might be more on the lookout for that with a woman. Yeah. And so, like, if a woman's talking to her doctor or something, the doctor might be already cued to think about, I want to make sure that this person is safe if she says something a little bit concerning. And then I think, again, there's that component of folks just not identifying as being trafficked. And so when we think about even trying to understand how much this is happening in New Hampshire, in the U.S., anywhere, it's really, really difficult to pinpoint, really, like, to get a real sense of what that number is. And we honestly, in a lot of ways, just have to take a best estimate for what it looks like.
And one thing, too, I would say is the geographic area can have an effect on what type of trafficking we're looking at. So, you might hear commonly things like, the Super Bowl. When the Super Bowl happens, there's a lot of sex trafficking going on. Well, that is true. The rates are the same. It's just more concentrated in that specific area.
Okay.
However, in New Hampshire, as you probably know, we've been dealing with an opioid epidemic for many years now. And unfortunately, forced criminality and forced use of opioids is a common tactic that traffickers use. Sometimes they even get their victims hooked on particular drugs so that they can maintain that control over them. So sometimes the geographic area matters in terms of what kind of trafficking we're seeing and what the perpetrators are taking advantage of. But outside of that, like I said, it's more what can they take advantage of with that particular person.
Once someone is in one of these situations, especially where they sometimes don't even know that that's what's happening to them, how do they typically get out of that situation?
It can be very hard. Before this job, I worked at a domestic and sexual violence crisis center. And this was kind of similar to what Miranda was just saying. We would get clients who'd come to us about a sexual assault situation or a domestic violence situation. And upon further investigation or talking with them more, learning that, okay, this is actually but also a trafficking situation. So a lot of the times, people who are seeking services for things like domestic and sexual violence, that is a time where sometimes it is identified that is that kind of situation. And those types of programs also serve victims of human trafficking too. Domestic violence is a term that covers interpersonal relationships, romantic relationships, but a lot of the time, like funding-wise and things like that, human trafficking kind of falls into that category. So basically any program that provides services for domestic and or sexual violence will also provide services for human trafficking. Not a lot of people know that, unfortunately. So those situations are kind of few and far between because it is hard, even as someone who's trained in that type of work, to figure out this is actually a trafficking situation because, like I've said so many times, they might not even really fully understand it themselves, let alone the dynamics of trafficking are pretty complicated, right? And there's a lot of misconceptions too. So that's why, those flyers and things like that in certain places can be helpful in situations where, like, there's agencies who train truck drivers and hotel staff and things like that to kind of look out for particular warning signs so that they can reach out to law enforcement. However, law enforcement is not something that all victims really want to utilize right away. Maybe they might want to later on after they feel safer, but traffickers do a really good job at instilling fear in law enforcement and other services. So they will tell them things like, no one will believe you, right? Things like that. You're addicted to drugs, so why would anyone believe you? Those kinds of things. So when people are seeking out services in mental health, in substance abuse, even going to the doctor, right? Asking the right questions and really looking at the situation can be helpful in getting that person help, whether or not you put the label of trafficking onto it. If they are in a violent situation or abusive type of situation, it doesn't need to fit under some certain category in order for them to be able to get the help that they need. Which is, I think, because of the domestic violence services, that's kind of the way that they work. It's like you screen in as a survivor of domestic violence. It's a little bit easier to screen in when it comes to domestic violence because there's a wide understanding of what domestic violence is now. It's been kind of going on since the 80s and 70s when programs like ours actually started getting funding and things like that. But when it comes to human trafficking, like we've talked about a few times here, it's not something that people really understand. If they know about it, they have a very limited view of it most of the time. And a lot of people think of it as like the movie Taken or, things they see on TV.
Yeah.
And that's not inclusive of everything. So if you're kind of only thinking of it in that way, like it needs to fall under this definition of trafficking, that's not necessarily true. They need to just they need help.
Yeah.
Right? So being able to offer them the kind of help that they need will be what helps them get out of the situation.
Okay.
So if somebody's being trafficked and their trafficker is using that substance use thing against them going to substance abuse treatment might be what they need to kind of get out of that situation.
Okay.
So it depends on what the perpetrators are taking advantage of.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So now could you tell us about Brigid's House of Hope, how it kind of got started and what the mission is?
Yeah, so Brigid's House was started by our founder, Bethany Cottrell. She was part of a movement, a few years ago when human trafficking kind of became a big topic that a lot of people were talking about, including in New Hampshire. So the state started a coalition or a collaborative task force specific to human trafficking. And Bethany has worked in different areas of victim advocacy, child advocacy. And so she was a part of this task force. And the conversations kind of went around how are we identifying people? What services are available? And one of the areas that was identified as a gap was housing. So housing, and particularly supportive housing, that really is attuned to the needs of trafficking survivors in particular. And Bethany was in on those conversations, and there was another organization that had a grant related to that population, and she went to that organization and she said, "Hey, housing is a need. What are you gonna do?" And they said, "Oh, we can't, but you can." And so then she did, because that's how she is. And she started it, at her kitchen table with her family and friends, like so many nonprofits start. And she said, okay, this is a need. There's nobody in the state doing this, so we're going to figure it out. And that's how Brigid's House was born. We opened in 2022. And we focus on supportive housing and holistic services for survivors of human trafficking in the state of New Hampshire. So at the beginning, that looked like having a safe house that was at a confidential location in the state where survivors from in New Hampshire and also from outside of New Hampshire could go. It was a voluntary program, so folks would come and they would live in the house in apartments, and they would live in the house and they would work with a case manager to identify the needs that they had. A lot of times that looks like things like they didn't have health insurance maybe, or they haven't seen a doctor in a little while. And so we're getting them connected to different services, and they stayed in the safe house for as long as they needed while we found longer term housing for them. So that kind of grew into also offering a program called rapid rehousing, which there's a lot of rapid rehousing programs across the state for different populations, and ours is the only one specific to human trafficking. So that looks like providing rental assistance for survivors to live in an apartment in the community. So it really embeds them within their community. We help them get connected to the different services in their individual community because they settle in different places, and help them try to get on their feet and feel safe and secure enough that they can build the lives that they want to live.
Okay. And would people, for the safe house, would they come to you themselves? Were they referred by another organization? How did that happen?
Both. So there were a few different ways they could come to us. We are a part of a couple of national networks of safe houses. So sometimes we would get referrals of individuals from other states who maybe were fleeing and needed to leave where they were. So that came in. That was a more like, professional or official looking referral. A lot of times we would get emails or phone calls from various sources, an emergency room nurse or a mental health counselor or someone who says, I am working with this person who either I think has been trafficked or they have identified that they are being trafficked and they need to get somewhere safe. And so, sometimes people just find us as a first step. And then we also did have people who self-referred. So on our first website, there was a tab about becoming a resident and they could self-refer and say, I need help.
Okay.
And either we would accept them into the program, or if they weren't a good fit, or if we were full, which was more often the case, we would connect them with perhaps one of those national networks that had more resources to try to find them a space to go.
Okay.
I think an important thing to mention too is that all of our programs, we do not require self-disclosure. So it does not need to be something where they say, I'm a victim of human trafficking. If they have been referred to our program and they have screened in, they don't need to say, I'm a victim of human trafficking in order to get into the program.
Yeah, and for the rapid rehousing program, the referrals really come through the continuum of care access points. So there's points in the state, it's usually the community action programs in the state where a person goes there. This is one of those situations where they go for services and then they're identified as maybe a match for us, and then that the staff at the community action program would call and say, I have this situation. It sounds kind of like trafficking. What do you think? And then, then we would talk about if we have room in the community-based program to put them in there. So sometimes it's folks who are seeking homeless services through other places and they kind of find their way to us.
Also, coordinated entry for domestic violence as well. So again, we've mentioned domestic violence and human trafficking. There's a good amount of overlap. So some people would be referred to the domestic violence one, and then they would say, well, it might sound a little bit like this is trafficking, and then it might come our way as well.
Okay.
So it can come from multiple angles within the coordinated entry program. There's a lot of access points throughout the state, including like domestic violence crisis centers and things like that too.
I guess now we should get into, so you're going to be potentially losing some of your funding. So I guess what is the reason for that and what is it going to affect?
Yeah. Unfortunately, we know that there are so many needs in our communities and so many nonprofits that are seeking things, and there's just never seems to be quite enough money. So one thing that we have dealt with in the last several months is our Safe House program was originally funded by a federal grant through the Department of Justice, our Office of Victims of Crime. And that grant happened kind of in that time frame, like I said earlier, of a few years ago when human trafficking was kind of the thing that everybody was talking about.
Okay.
And it was kind of coming onto the scene as a new conversation, not a new experience, but a new conversation.
Sure.
And so it was well-timed for our founder to start applying for those grants because it was just starting out. There were only a handful of people applying for that funding. We found out in the fall of 2024 that we were not going to be able to renew that grant. And grants are tricky. There's a lot of reasons for why grants don't get renewed. For this particular one, a good part of it was simply just the competition. Going for federal grants is really competitive anyway. But the difference between when we originally applied for the grant and there were maybe 20 other applicants and 10 to 15 awards given, this time there were closer to 85 applicants and 10 awards given, right? And one of the hard parts about doing this work in a state like New Hampshire is we're a little bit smaller. We are a little bit more rural, and so a lot of the funds this time went to bigger states. They went to programs in Texas, they went to programs in New York, and it's hard to hold both things of being so disappointed that we weren't able to get that funding when we were really one of the only people in the state addressing this need, and also holding that, those programs also need funding, and I'm so glad that they have that.
Sure.
That tension's can be challenging to hold sometimes. But the unfortunate result of that is that in December, our board voted that in order to keep the organization running, we actually needed to close our Safe House program. So the Safe House is closing tomorrow, the end of January, the last day of January, because we just simply couldn't sustain the funding that we needed. So we had 2 people living in the Safe House, one single adult and then a mom and a baby. And we needed to move them to some other placements, which we did, and slowly close that program. And then we're going to continue with our community-based program, which is funded through a grant through the state. So, there are a lot of reasons for grants to not get renewed. I mean, so much of it, every grant reviewer, whether it's a small foundation or a federal grant, gets down to the point where there's a lot of amazing people doing amazing work, and you have to find reasons to distinguish between one or the other. So maybe this program's going to serve more people, or maybe it has a new component that they're interested in investing in. And sometimes it's things like, you answered in the form of a paragraph instead of a table. And, because it has to get that nitty gritty. And I have a lot of empathy for grant reviewers, because I imagine it's really difficult to turn people down. So, it's been a challenge for us across the board. It's been challenging for nonprofits, honestly, for a long time. Systemically, the way that nonprofits are funded is extremely problematic, to say the least, and is really not set up for them to succeed. And then in the last year or so, it's been hard for all nonprofits to sustain the funding, to make sure that they're able to get grant renewals. A lot of us rely also on individual donations, and it's been a hard couple of years for folks, right?
So less people have the funds to donate.
Which is so challenging. And, we also face, I think, a unique challenge in that our programs cost a lot of money, right? Housing people is expensive. We're dealing with also the housing crisis in New Hampshire that's affecting everyone, no matter who you are or what your experience is. There's not enough housing. It's crazy expensive. People can't afford it. And, so us housing a number of people, it takes thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars every single month. And sometimes I think, whether it's a grantor or an individual donor, it's really enticing to send that money to a program that can say, this $100 donation is going to touch 100 people, because it can go to, we're going to be able to feed 100 people. We're going to be able to do these things, which are so, so, so needed. And then for us, it's like, well, this is going to go toward groceries for someone, or it's going to go toward a really small portion of their rent for 1 month, and we need to have a lot of those portions of rent for all 5 of our people for the whole year is what we need to figure out. So, it's a challenge sometimes to communicate that need in a way that people really can internalize and understand.
Sure. So going forward, can people donate through your website? Do you have any fundraisers or events coming up that you'd like to share?
Yeah, you can always donate through our website. And we launched our new website just this month, which was exciting. We received a donation from Loud Canvas Media Group. They're over on the Seacoast, and they fully revamped our website, and they're giving us all kinds of amazing consultation on how to get the word out about who we are. So there's a number of different ways laid out on our website of how you can donate. You can set up a one-time donation and just do one lump sum. You can set up monthly donations, which is incredibly helpful because that's consistent income for us, right? And then there's also other ways of giving, like corporate sponsorships and including it in maybe estate planning and things like that. There's a number of different ways to give. And then you can always look at what we're doing in the community. So, you can follow us on Instagram and on Facebook to see. Our website has a page specific to our events. We just finished up a couple of them. So we had a calendar raffle that we just wrapped up, and I think Bethany's announcing the winners soon. And one of our previous board members and now just a community volunteer named Christina, she's fabulous, put on an art auction in Portsmouth for us recently, which we're going to be moving online because she received almost 100 pieces of art and we could not. Wow. Yeah, it was amazing. All from local artists. And that was just felt very supportive and amazing. So we're going to be posting that online soon. We have a couple other things that are kind of in the works. We have a partnership with a local magazine called Greet Bedford, and they have a annual event in April that they're sponsoring our organization for. So if you attend that event, if you look them up and attend that event, you're supporting them and all the cool things that they do, and then also supporting us and all the cool things that we do.
Oh, that's great.
I'm always open to things like that too.
Mm-hmm.
If other organizations or people are looking to do, some sort of fundraiser like an art auction, that's something that we would be open to as well.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Great. So I guess out of my curiosity, because just even in doing this episode, I've been educated in just how prevalent human trafficking is. And one, I don't think it's probably talked about enough.
Mm-hmm.
But is there any way to stop it from happening for good or at least make progress? I don't even know where to start with that. But
I think it is possible.
Okay.
It will take a lot of hard work and dedication, just like if you think about domestic violence services, right? They've been working since the 70s against domestic violence, and it's not done with yet. But the education and prevention stuff that they are able to do has made a difference in the lives of individuals, young people, those kinds of things too. So even being educated about it is helpful in knowing that programs like ours exist and do need help, unfortunately.
Okay. Sure.
And because of that, there are so many different ways that people can help, and sometimes people are a little nervous about,
Sure.
I'm not going to make that much money off of this, or I'm not going to be able to do anything significant for the agency. But like we said, our agency, it is a holistic type of program. So we try to address all the different parts of someone's life, like their mental health, like, just having health insurance, all those
Sure.
different things. So making sure that people in different types of programs or just in the community as a whole are getting those types of supports, it really will make a huge difference, because those perpetrators use those vulnerabilities against the victims. So if you're able to get somebody into a program where maybe they're not using drugs anymore, or maybe they are a little more mentally stable, I guess you could say, than they were before, they might not be as prone to getting into that kind of situation.
Sure.
Not that it's their fault, but again, it's
Right.
those vulnerabilities. So addressing those vulnerabilities would make a really big difference. And that includes a lot of different things, so that's not like a super direct answer.
Oh, no.
But I think there's a lot of work to be done. There's a lot of educating to be done of the public in general, that these things do happen, and that they happen everywhere, not just, overseas or wherever people think. Even just knowing that in itself can make a big difference. Teaching kids,
Sure.
What to look out for, making sure kids have those supports, people that they can talk to, things like that. All of those things are very important. And I think if we continue to work in that way, I do think that we can see a light at the end of the tunnel.
Yeah, I think that we wouldn't be here if we didn't believe that
Sure.
change was possible, right?
Yeah.
And I do think, like, I would echo everything that Sarah said, and know that this is something that every person doing what they can in the areas that they're passionate about will help. So I want to, do a call to action for everyone to donate to support our organization or another one that provides these services to trafficking survivors. And then to think about, we're living in a very intense world and there's a lot of things going on and a lot of things that people want to help with. And sometimes that can feel really overwhelming. And so one of the things that I hope is a helpful comment for folks is human trafficking is something where it's not a one point problem. It's not like there's one point of intervention where if we do this thing, then it's going to be fixed for this person or it's going to go away. It's a whole system experience, right? It's about housing. It's about mental health. It's about physical health. It's about food access. It's about economic justice. It's about all of those things. And so if you're doing any kind of volunteer work or professional work or donating to organizations that really reliably address those things, you're also helping the system to help take care of the people that we take care of. Mm-hmm. So I do think that there exists a possible future where these things, I would love for it to never happen at all, or at least don't happen nearly as much. And we have seen change happen. We have seen women live lives that they never thought that they would be able to live and never thought that they deserved. And, those are really simple things. It's like, I get to live in an apartment with my cats and have 100 plants that I love, or a lot of, so it's a big problem that feels so scary in so many ways. And also the things that we can do and the things that anyone who's listening can do can be so much simpler than you think.
I will also say too, we don't necessarily like that it is, unfortunately, federal funding and things like that. It is a political issue in some ways. Mm-hmm. So being able to do things like write to your congresspeople, things like that about the importance of programs like ours and the types of funding that they need can be really, really helpful in the long run. And also, again, it could raise awareness with those who might be able to make a big difference in that regard, too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a lot that can happen at the advocacy level, for sure.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point. I'm glad you brought that up because I think sometimes people want to help, but they just don't know what steps to take, and that's a really good one they can take to, because our Congress people, senators, all that have all kinds of things they're thinking about that this issue might not even be on their radar. So just writing to them about that, at least giving them awareness. So if it comes up on something they have to vote on, they have a little more knowledge about it and everything.
Yep.
So
yeah, and New Hampshire's small in so many ways. Like people, we all know someone who knows someone who knows someone. And so the more that we talk about it with each other, the more support we get. It does make it more possible to do things like go after federal funding and be able to ensure that federal funding will stay accessible as for whenever we need it, and even change some of the ways that we think about how funding should happen and where, there's so many opportunities to help be a part of impacting reducing human trafficking.
Yeah. As we've been discussing, it made me think of something else. Are they doing any education about this in schools? Or is that kind of, they're not allowed to do that? Or
yeah, I think
it's complicated.
Yeah,
in some ways.
It's complicated. It's a difficult topic to talk about with adults, right?
Yeah.
Every time I do a talk, I feel like I have to start with, this is a little heavy for a Tuesday morning, but we're gonna be okay. We can do this. We can talk about this and not fall into that place of despair. And with kids, it can feel extra complicated because you're always trying to balance wanting them to be as informed at an age appropriate level as much as possible so we can keep them safe and also not have everyone be afraid all the time.
Yeah, that's
because
true.
I'm a parent. It would be impossible to send my kids to a summer camp if I'm filled with fear.
Right.
And I don't want to take away them going to a summer camp. That's a child experience that they need to
Yeah.
have, right? So, doing it can be really difficult. There are some organizations that is their main focus, is doing prevention education. One that's fairly local to New England is called Thrive New England. They're based out of Maine right now, but their purpose, a key part of their mission is going into high schools and educating teenagers on like social media and how to watch out for the vulnerable places that they can find themselves in that arena, and parents and how to notice that something maybe is going on. And, sometimes that means that they identify kids who are being trafficked and they're intervening and helping the kid and the parent really figure out what they need to do. And other times it is truly prevention of, these things happen, and I know it's kind of scary, but we can talk about scary things in a way that still makes you feel like you're safe in the world.
Yeah.
But it's hard to do, especially with younger kids too. But we know, I used to work with foster children, and I worked with a lot of foster children who are trafficked. And so these are conversations that we have to have with our younger kids. I know for me, with my kids, it's about talking about how to know when you're with a safe person, and how to trust yourself if you feel like you might not be with a safe person, and really rehearsing who are the people that you can go to, making that not just me, but any of the safe people in their lives. And when they, go hang out with our older neighbors and for the day, because they like to play cards with them, it's also checking in really regularly on, those are people that I trust. And I also am going to check in every once in a while on, how are things going? And, keeping in contact with them, because I know now. I know what the statistics are about that. So
Yeah, I'd say it's difficult, one, because of funding. It can be hard especially when it comes to younger kids, in getting funding, being able to talk freely about these types of issues. There have unfortunately been some bills and things that have passed in recent years that have prevented agencies from bringing up things like racial justice when they're doing those types of education, which those things all have a part to play in human trafficking. But the other thing that I think is important to note is that parents can do this kind of education with their kids. It's not something that has to be done by a professional that knows about human trafficking, right? If you are able to educate your kids on things like consent, right, that's a big one, and things like healthy relationships and all of those different things that are not really taught in school or anything like that. And unfortunately, the media kind of sometimes blurs the lines in those regards. It is something that parents can do and family members can do in terms of, teaching their kids what is healthy and what things should look like, so that if something feels off, like Marina said at the beginning, they know that something can and should be done at that point,
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you. I think that'll be really helpful for people. I know it's helpful for me.
Yeah.
So, is there anything else you'd like to share about Brigid's house or anything we've talked about today?
I mean, I think I like to talk about what it looks like for us to provide service to folks, because I think there's like, so they help them get medical care and they help them get housing and those things. And those are really the tasks that we do. But I say this to everyone. I say it all the time. Sarah's heard it so many times. I just like, those are the things that we do, but the way of being and how we work is the more important way, is like the most special thing about Brigid's. It's, I said it earlier that we're a voluntary program. That means that we are prioritizing that survivor's voice and choice in every single thing that we're doing. So we, as much as we can, are not telling, we're asking. So they choose when and if they're ready to go to mental health counseling. They choose where they want to live. They choose as many things as we can give away, as many choices as we can give back. It's what we're doing, because their experience of not having power and control was so profound that engaging with someone who's in a professional role with them, who is always going to have some level of power over, because that's the nature of helping. If I'm the helper, then I have something that the person I'm helping needs, right? So there's already a power differential. And we try to reduce that as much as possible and let them be in control of everything and help them like navigate what that feels like, because that can be extremely overwhelming and pretty terrifying when you haven't had that experience for sometimes decades or maybe ever. So we really focus on training our staff to be really deeply trauma informed, which means empowering our clients, giving them voice in making decisions on the changes that they want to make and where they want to go. It involves accounting for systems of oppression that have been at play in addition to the trafficking situation that they've lived in. And so that looks like, I think pragmatically, that looks like, we don't provide a lot of we don't directly provide counseling to our folks. We connect them to a counseling center in the community. We don't directly provide medical care. We connect them to a medical center in the community. And what we do is we work with those people, those providers in the community, to understand our clients and what their needs are and how different and special and sometimes like very difficult they can be, so that when Brigid's house is not involved in that client's life anymore, that survivor has the support that they need in their community, and it really sets them up to be successful without relying on us, because we know if they were totally relying on us, that would be another dynamic of power, right? Even if it's one that's unintentional and well-meaning. So I think that's something that's very special about our program, is how committed we are to being so trauma informed and so radically focused on empowerment that, like, sometimes our survivors make decisions that we wish that would be different, and they are full adult individual people who get to make the choices that they make, and ultimately we're still going to be there and support them when they do those things. And when the trauma that they've experienced comes up and their brains say to do things that are confusing or aggressive or contraindicated to what their goals are, that we can handle that and we can help them navigate what that looks like. And that's an all the time job. That's, Sarah spends a lot of time filling out housing applications, I can tell you that. But we definitely spend more time helping someone cope with the process of finding housing and the feelings that it brings up for them to have the hope of having their own housing, and the fear that it's not going to be there, and the fear that they don't deserve it. And like, that's more of the work that we do. And that's part of why, we're always looking for funding. It's about paying their rent, but it's also about compensating our staff, who have to be so specialized because the needs are so specialized and so unique.
Sure.
Yeah.
That makes sense. So then I just have two final questions I ask everybody that comes on. The first being, which nonprofit you think we should feature next?
I mean, we've already mentioned Thrive New England, but I think they're a really great one in terms of the human trafficking work. They don't just do direct services with survivors, like we mentioned. They also do education and things like that as well. So I think they're a really great organization, and they were founded by a trafficking survivor themselves. So it is, I think within this field, I think that's a good one to mention.
Okay.
I think another one that's outside of the trafficking realm, because we love to support nonprofits of all kinds, is the, I need to remember the name correctly, Betty J. Borey Cancer Retreat Center. So I have a personal connection to that kind of a program because my mother-in-law is a 2-time breast cancer survivor. And so they do some really beautiful work with hosting retreats for folks who have experienced breast cancer at any part of their journey, to offer just a space for healing and a break and camaraderie and all of those things. And they're another, small organization that serves all of New England, and they're also going through funding challenges that might make it difficult for them to continue some of their programs. And so I love to support someone who's doing important work in a totally different way and needs just as much help as we do too.
Yeah, and I love when it's ones I'm not familiar with, because of course I want to give exposure to nonprofits of all sizes and give them recognition and everything.
Yeah.
So that's great. And then the last thing, I know it can be hard to choose one thing, so if you just have an example of what comes to mind, is the kindest thing you've witnessed or been a part of?
I would say, thinking within the realm of the work that I do, the thing that is most impactful for the survivors that I've worked with is literally like listening to their concerns. So, I have one client who has a lot of medical needs, and having a doctor at an appointment actually listen to her and understand her needs made the biggest difference in the world for how she handled that situation. So I think for me, it comes to those individuals like really paying attention to the needs of someone and also understanding their trauma, which is really hard, I would say, in this world. So, yeah.
The first one that came to my mind was actually just a personal example, and it's so small, but I was thinking about my son. He's 8, and he played baseball in the spring, and he was on this team with all these kids that were, I think, probably like 5 to 7, which is a big range, honestly.
Yeah.
A small 5-year-old and a big 7-year-old. There's a big difference there. And he was one of the older kids, and they're like practicing, and he hit the ball, and he was supposed to run to first base, and he kind of like ran around the base behind the girl that was on it to come back at it, and he got tagged out. She tagged him out. And so when he came off, I said, "Bud, like, what were you doing? Like, that did you get like?" I was just so confused. I'm like, what are you? And he said, "Well, she's just a lot smaller than me, and the person before knocked her over, and I didn't want her to get hurt again." So he slowed down and walked around the base, and I just thought, oh my gosh, like that was so, I mean, nobody told him to do that. He just had this innocent just awareness of, here's a person that is different than me in this way, and I'm going to be gentle with them. And I thought that was so sweet and profound in its own way of just in super simple ways we can be aware of other people and what has happened to them previously, someone pushing them, getting knocked around in a baseball game, or just noticing a difference between you and another person and being gentle with that difference. So.
Yeah, I think that's a great example, and wonderful that, at a young age, he had that thought to himself and thought to do that. So.
Yeah, and it got him out, and he felt good about it. And I was like, that's a good reason to get out. I'm going to be honest. So
that's wonderful.
And also, next time you can still run and touch the base.
Right, yeah. That's a great story. Yeah. Well, thank you both so much for being here. I know I've been educated, and I hope that everyone who listens to this will be as well, and will take time to not only look into your organization, but human trafficking in general and other organizations that support it. So hopefully we can make an impact on this going on and everything. So
thank you so much for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you. I hope that you enjoyed today's episode. I hope it was informative for you. And again, I hope you will share it with everyone you know so we can spread the word and bring awareness to this issue with as many people as possible. You can also help by rating and reviewing the podcast, following Dose of Good Podcast on Instagram and Facebook. Leave me your feedback and comments on YouTube. Also give the video a thumbs up so that more people can find it. Subscribe to the Dose of Good YouTube channel if you haven't already. But again, thank you to Sarah and Miranda for being on this episode, raising awareness about human trafficking and Brigid's House of Hope. And I hope that you will check them out. Thanks for supporting the podcast, and I'll see you again soon with another episode.